period. Now you would expect that since the chapter is called The Period, Dickens would offer us some description of what the period was like in terms of ways of life, politics, and so on. Well, let's see what he does give us. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received for good or evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. So the conclusion is that it is a time of extremes, and it is like our time, or like Dickens's time, and also like our time. This tells us nothing specific about the period. He goes on. In England, there was a king with a large jaw and a queen with a plain face on the throne of England. There were a king with a large jaw and a queen with fair face on the throne of France. So again, there's no distinction really between England and France. His point is that they're similar, almost the same, the differentiating factor being the beauty of the queens. Furthermore, he says, that it is as clear as crystal to the lords of the state preserves of loaves and fishes that things in general were settled forever. So both countries make this same assumption that nothing is going to change. Now he calls them the state preserves of loaves and fishes, in an allusion to the Bible, when Jesus takes one loaf of bread and 2 fishes and feeds the multitudes. Sadly, neither the King of England nor the King of France is capable of performing such a miracle, and certainly the presence of loaves of bread and other food items is going to be an issue. Now in England, Dickens goes on to describe an interesting phenomenon, which is that there's a lot of interest in messages from the spirit world. So interests in ghosts, in trying to contact spirits and trying to contact the dead was a fad in England, both at the end of the 18th century and in Dickens' time in the mid-19th century. His point here is that people are so interested in these fake messages from the spirit world that they miss the important message, which was a message from America, which was the Declaration of Independence. So as he tells us that, strange to relate, this has proved more important to the human race than any communications yet received through any of the chickens of the Cock Lane brood. So that's an allusion to a particular school of mysticism, but all of these interests in the spirit world and contacting the dead is nothing to this actual message from America, which, of course, in the period Dickens is talking about, is a new message. France, similarly, is distracted by the fact that they are producing paper money, which has led to hyperinflation, which, as Dickens points out, ensures that they are going downhill, rolling with exceeding smoothness downhill, making paper money and spending it. Now, he also points out that under the guidance of their Christian pastors, they are engaged in some rather barbarous punishments for some rather strange crimes. France is still a Roman Catholic country, so he points out that a young man who did not show sufficient respect to a religious group was horribly executed. At the same time, though, that France is paying attention to money, paying attention to crime, what they're not noticing is that something else is beginning to happen, something that involves fate and death. So here, Dickens's language becomes metaphorical. So he says that even as this young man he's talking about was put to death, there were trees already marked by the woodman Fate to come down and be sawn into boards to make a certain movable framework with a sack and a knife in it, terrible in history. It is likely enough that in the rough outhouses of some tillards of the heavy lands adjacent to Paris, there were sheltered from the weather that very day rude carts, besmattered with rustic mire and snuffed about by pigs, which the farmer death had already set apart to be his tumbrils of the revolution. But that woodman and that farmer, although they work unceasingly, work silently, and no one heard them as they went about with muffled tread, the rather forasmuch as to entertain any suspicion that they were awake was to be atheistical and traitorous. So no attention is being paid to these two metaphorical histories and figures, and here Dickens is using his best prophetic voice, laden with foreshadowing, to let you know that fate and death are at work, notwithstanding that people of England and France are not paying attention. He also points out that the legal situation in England is not much superior to that in France, and one of the most significant problems, which will come up again in the next chapter, is the problem of robbery, notably highway robbery. We still have this as an expression for a particularly brazen kind of robbery, and this is exactly what the highwaymen were. They would stop coaches and order the people who were either passengers in the coaches or who were guarding the coaches to turn over everything of value they had on their persons or in the coach. So, as Dickens observes in this chapter, that daring burglaries by armed men and highway robberies took place in the capital itself every night. And he says that the highwayman in the dark was a city tradesman in the night. So these were other people who held jobs, ordinary people, but by night they were masked robbers. He claims, too, that this was being seen as kind of a normal. The mail was waylaid by 7 robbers. This is the mail coach, with which we will be concerned shortly. Was waylaid by 7 robbers. The guard shot 3 dead, then got shot dead himself by the other 4 in consequence of the failure of his ammunition, after which the mail was robbed in peace. So people began to think maybe it wasn't worth defending. Similarly, he talks about riots in jails where the jailers fight with the prisoners and the law comes bursting in and fires their guns off. A raid to try to stop smuggling. The musketeers went into St. Giles to search for contraband. The mob fired on the musketeers fired on the mob, and nobody thought any of these occurrences much out of the common way. So there seems to be a kind of legal chaos. Notwithstanding that, Dickens does not approve of what seemed to be the answer to every problem of crime, which was the gallows. And he points out that the gallows was overused. It was used for things that were unimportant as well as things that were important. He says, in the midst of them, the hangman, ever busy, ever worse than useless, was in constant requisition, stringing up long rolls of miscellaneous criminals, today taking the life of an atrocious murderer, and tomorrow of a wretched pilferer who had robbed a farmer's boy of 6pence. So the proportion seems to be wrong. There would be much to concern us as we go into the novel with crime, with the legal system, with systems of punishment. But for now, all Dickens has to tell us is that these are the kinds of things that were, as he says, closing in, came to pass and close in on the dear old year 1775, which is the main thing we know about the period at this point, which is the actual year. Environed by them, while the woodman and the farmer, fate and death, worked unheeded, those 2 of the large jaws and those other 2 of the plain and fair faces trod with stir enough and carried their divine rights with a high hand. So the divine right of kings suggested that it was God that had appointed them king, and therefore they could not be dethroned, they could not be rebelled against. That at least is their opinion. Thus did the year 1775 conduct their greatnesses and myriads, thousands of small creatures, the creatures of this chronicle among the rest, along the roads that lay before them. So this leads us into the story, but without a whole lot of information about the period. Certainly his goal here is to show the similarities between England and France, the similarities between that time and his time, and indeed our time, and to do enough interesting foreshadowing that we will all go on reading.